The sanctuary's silence landed on me like an old wet coat, heavy, cold, impossible to shrug off. When Bishop Williams reached across the pulpit and took the microphone from my hands, his fingers were steady. His voice was lower than I expected, small enough to be meant only for me, loud enough for the first pew to hear every syllable. "Sister Ruth, you shouldn't be here," he said. The words slid along my skin like a blade. My knees went soft. My sermon, folded into the pocket of my dress, felt as if it were burning. That morning had begun ordinary. Sunlight slipped through my kitchen curtains and painted the table gold while the coffee pot sighed and the toast popped. The smell of fresh coffee filled the house, warm and bitter against the linen of the tablecloth. I folded the sermon 3 times, the paper creasing where I had smoothed it with careful fingers. At 68 you learn to steady your hands with ritual. A rinse of cold water, the weight of the Bible against your palm, the tiny pearl earrings that never leave my lobes. I could feel my pulse in my throat when the phone rang. "Brother Bishop canceled you," Sarah said, voice frayed like a seam. She was the church secretary, thin, nervous, the kind of person who keeps minutes and secrets in equal measure. She hesitated, then said, He reconsidered about women in the pulpit. 6 months before, the council vote had been a small miracle. I still remembered his handshake that night, that smile he gave me like an award. Now suddenly the handshake meant nothing. I told Sarah I would be there. I wrapped my sermon in the palm of my hand like a piece of fragile fruit and went. The parish hall was a furnace of opinion. Voices rose and fell like hemodynamics. The sound of cups, the whoosh of a fan, the faint metallic clack of Esther's brooch when she settled into her seat. Esther found me before the service began. Her purple hat was a beacon. Her white-gloved fingers squeezed my arm. "He gathered the elders last night," she whispered, breath smelling faintly of peppermint. She had the steadiness of someone who had fed 100 children's tummies and patched 100 hearts. After the Thompsons promised that donation, he changed his mind. The name landed like a stone. Money, I learned long ago, is a language that can silence other tongues. My grandson Marcus slipped up beside me, his shoulder brushing mine, the scent of his cologne, a little soap, a little youth grounding me. "You belong up there," he said, quick and bright like a pledge. He didn't say more. He didn't need to. His jaw set. His fingers found mine for a moment and pressed. By the time the organ started, the air inside the sanctuary had the cool dryness of an old room. Varnish, dust, flowers. The pews had familiar dents in their arms where generations had gripped them during scandal and prayer. I sat in the front row with the Bible on my lap, its cover softened by years, the edges of pages threaded with colorful ribbons. My sermon burned in my pocket like a secret I had sworn to keep. When I rose to go to the pulpit, the room seemed to narrow. Bishop Williams watched me with those blue eyes that had once held a smile. Deacon Phillips leaned forward and murmured something into the bishop's ear. The bishop's jaw tightened in a way I hadn't seen before. I touched the microphone as I always had, the metal cool under my fingertips. Then his hand was there, deliberate, closing the space between us. "Sister Ruth," he said again, and this time his tone carried the authority of one used to being obeyed. I let my Bible fall. It hit the wooden floor with a dull, heavy thud and flipped open. The pages fluttered, reluctant moths. At first I thought only I would see the way the paper shifted, the way the light caught the edges. Then I saw it. The yellowed letters, the signatures, the old ledger entries I had found while organizing the church archives. Lines that told about money given for women's leadership programs, and lines that traced where that money had not gone. He went white enough that his artificial tan could not hide it. For a moment the sanctuary smelled like dust and something metallic, the heat of it pressing under my tongue. "Brothers and sisters," he started quickly, too quickly, "let us pray." There was a pause like the held breath before a chorus begins. Deacon Johnson, who moves slow but speaks sure, stood up using his cane. His voice was thin, but it filled the aisle. "Bishop," he said, and when he said it there was no pleading in his tone. "Maybe we should hear Sister Ruth." The first few people rose like a chorus learning the hymn. Esther, her hat a bright comet as she stood. Marcus, shoulders straight. Rebecca, cradling her baby and standing as if defending 2 generations. No shouting. No placards. Just feet moving one by one until half the room was upright, eyes fixed on me, on the open Bible, on the papers like a map. The bishop looked out over the faces he had shepherded for decades. For the first time I watched him struggle with a decision that did not have a ledger attached. He moved his hand slowly, the ring catching light, and pushed the microphone back toward me. "The word is yours, Deaconess Ruth," he said, and there was a new edge to his voice. Not quite contrition, not quite respect. When I took the microphone, my hand trembled so violently, I heard the soft rattle of my pearl earrings. I folded my sermon back into my pocket as if tucking a child in. The paper was still warm. Around us the organ swelled like a tide, and someone I had taught in Sunday school years ago whispered, "Amen," loud enough to be heard. 3 weeks later, I sit on my porch and watch the sunset lay itself across Oak Ridge like an old quilt. Things have shifted. Some doors have closed. Others have opened. The center will be built in a way that I can believe in now, smaller donors, more voices. Every Sunday I step up into that pulpit carrying the weight of a little paper in my pocket, and the heft of an old, worn Bible beneath my arm. The room is never as silent as it was the day the microphone was taken. It hums now with possibility, and with the sound of people choosing sides and sometimes choosing each other. The sanctuary's silence landed on me like an old wet coat, heavy, cold, impossible to shrug off. When Bishop Williams reached across the pulpit and took the microphone from my hands, his fingers were steady. His voice was lower than I expected, small enough to be meant only for me, loud enough for the first pew to hear every syllable. "Sister Ruth, you shouldn't be here," he said. The words slid along my skin like a blade. My knees went soft. My sermon, folded into the pocket of my dress, felt as if it were burning. "My loves, thank you for being here and giving me a few minutes of your day. This channel is still finding its feet, and every new subscriber breathes life into our little community. If this story touches you, please click subscribe. Our first goal is 1,000 souls. And tell me in the comments which city you're watching from." The morning I woke up feeling as if the week had been stitched into my bones, the kitchen light came in slow and honest. It poured through the curtains like a hand offering comfort. Pale then gold. The coffee pot hissed and the house filled with that bitter, clean smell I have loved since I was a girl. Grounds hot water, something steady to hang a morning on. I spooned sugar into my cup without thinking, feeling the metal cool against my fingers. At 68 you learn to keep small rituals. Pearl earrings every Sunday. A hymn in my head while I tie my shoes. The Bible that has hugged my hand since my mother passed. Its leather soft where my thumb rubs the edge. Sits on my kitchen table with prayer notes tucked between pages like quiet lovers. This morning my sermon was folded beside it, creased into neat quarters. I had rewritten it 3 times. Each draft felt like a new confession. People in Oak Ridge know me by my small habits. I hum as I set the table. I leave the back bedroom light on in winter for anyone coming home late. For 49 years I sang in the choir, taught the little ones their first memory verses, organized potlucks with more casseroles than sense. When the council voted to allow women as deacons, my chest filled with a kind of holy astonishment. It felt like the church inhaling after holding its breath for too long. The sun that morning pressed warm onto the windowsill. I could hear, faintly, the bell from the chapel clock across the street. 3 soft chimes, the kind that make your shoulders drop because the day is properly counted. The purple curtain behind the pulpit hangs heavy. We only draw it back for special seasons. Purple has always felt like a promise to me. Dignity, mourning, the kind of color that asks for respect. I ironed my dress carefully, the teal catching the light. When I touched that paper, it felt like touching a promise that had been folded up and placed in a drawer. I remember the sound of the church door closing behind me that evening, the whisper of the radiator, the smell of old varnish. I took photocopies and left the originals where I found them. I went home and folded the copies into my Bible as if tucking someone into bed. I did not know yet that paper would feel hot in my pocket. There are symbols in our sanctuary that speak louder than sermons. The brass cross on the altar bears the little grooves of decades of polish. Someone always leaves a single white candle burning during prayer. Lean and honest. The second pew on the left has been kept empty most Sundays for a widow who used to sit there, for a memory of a seat saved. Lately that pew has become a quiet witness. Sometimes I sit there when I want to be reminded of absence. Esther came over the night before the service. She wears hats like flags, and her laugh is the kind of laugh that settles arguments without needing to name them. We brewed tea and sat at my table with the sermon between us. "You look like you're going to war," she said, but her hand was warm when she squeezed mine. She has seen controversies fold and unfold in this church like pages in a well-read book. Her eyes, a small fierce brown, measured the lines on my face and then slid away to the window where the church steeple cut the sky. "Promise me you'll speak your truth," she said. There was a steadiness in her voice that made me think of altar rails and hymnals, of a life built on small courage. Truth has a way of finding the light. She tucked a tissue into her purse with hands practiced by years of weddings and funerals. Marcus called late. He was tense with homework and schedules, but there was a young man's bright certainty there too. "You okay, Nana?" he asked. His voice was a thread of soap and laundry detergent, smell of a dorm room in the background. He does not hide things from me. He never has. If they give you trouble, we'll be there. When I lay out my sermon that night, I lit the candle on my mantel and watched the flame lean toward the page. I whispered the opening lines as if testing a piano key. The words tasted right when they left my mouth, humble, firm, full of the stories of women who taught me how to pray when no one listened. I folded the paper and slid it into the pocket of my dress. It warmed there, a small pulsing thing. I slept fitfully, the house making its ordinary noises, the refrigerator's low hum, the neighbor's dog barking once, a porch light clicking off. In the morning the air had a hush that feels like expectation. I could smell the bread from Mrs. Carter down the street, the faint chlorine from the church's drinking fountain, the perfume of lilies on the altar that someone had left overnight. I smoothed my pearls and felt their familiar weight. When I stepped out the door, the purple curtain behind the pulpit seemed to wave at me in the bright morning, and the empty pew waited like a question. I did not know then how many people would stand with me, or how the old ledger would make the room lean in. I only knew that the paper in my pocket and the Bible under my arm were honest things. I only knew I had been called to this place for a long time, and that some promises, even those tucked away in dusty boxes, have a way of coming home. The moment his hand closed over the microphone, the room narrowed. Everything outside that small circle of polished wood and hymnals fell away. The stained glass like a storybook, the brass cross catching light, the faces in the first pew suddenly so close you could read the lines around their eyes. Bishop Williams' fingers were steady. His voice was low, but the first row heard it clear as a bell. "Sister Ruth, you shouldn't be here." The words landed like winter air. My stomach emptied and my knees wanted to fold. I could feel the fabric of my dress catch at my legs. Old habits tried to settle me. Breathe in through your nose, out through your mouth. Remember the cadence of a hymn, the way you slow on a phrase. But my hands had gone slick with sweat. The sermon in my pocket, the page I'd smoothed and folded 3 times the night before, pressed hot against my thigh like an accusation. There was a new sound then. Not a shout, not yet, but a small incredulous rustling, like when a congregation leans forward in a story. I knew every rustle in this room. I could tell when somebody had learned the words to a verse. I could tell when someone had been hurt. In that thin sound I tasted fear and something else, the fragile possibility of standing. I felt my jaw working. My tongue was thick as days of prayer when your throat has been dry for too long. I wanted to speak, to tell him this was not between us, that the council had voted, that my name had been placed on the roster for weeks. But the bishop has a way of making authority move like a tide. His hand on the microphone was not simply to stop my words. It was a public marking. He had put a line down across the pulpit and said, "You stay there." I thought of the ledgers again, of the cigar box smelling of attic dust and the thin paper that had made me hold my breath. I thought of the small memo that had been folded into someone else's decision and left like a sigh in a drawer. I thought of the center, of children in Oak Ridge with no after-school place, and of the Thompsons' pledge sitting on the table like a bright coin. For a long beat I let those images move through me, like prayer beads between my fingers. My heart beat so loudly I could hear it fill my ears. The breath in my chest felt thick and slow like syrup. My palms had cooled suddenly, then warmed, then cooled again. I rubbed them on my skirt as if smoothing a stubborn wrinkle. Marcus' hand had been on my shoulder that morning when we walked in, that quick, young pressure that meant he would stand, but I could not ask him to stand for me in every way. Some things had to be done by one's own feet. When he repeated the words, not loud but with the kind of certainty that expects obedience, I felt the decision crystallize. It was not a plan I had written in neat lines. It was not a sermon point I had prepared. It was small and sharp and urgent. The paper in my pocket was not only for preaching. It was proof of a promise broken. If I let it remain hidden, the ledger would slide back into the attic of memory, and the women it named would be folded away again. My fingers went to my Bible as if by instinct, the way you touch your mother's hand in a dark kitchen. The leather was soft under my thumb, the edges threaded with the ribbons I had used to chart favorite passages for years. I could feel the photocopies I had tucked inside, the thinness of that paper that had been touched by other hands before mine. The Bible had the weight of my life in it. Not just scripture, but baptisms and funerals, potluck lists, children's names I had written down when they learned to say Jesus loves me. The bishop's eyes flicked to the book as I reached for it. For a second his face was all practiced calm. Then something changed. Maybe it was the way the pages caught the light. Maybe it was the memory of the ledger I'm not meant to carry. In that change the past and the present collided. I let it go. The book hit the floor with a soft single thud and careened open. The sound in that room is something I will always remember. Not loud but utterly clear, as if the floor itself had spoken. Pages lifted like startled birds. The photocopies, imperfect and slightly curled, slipped free and lay there where the light from the window could find them. You could see the yellowed ink at once. Old handwriting that looped and leaned, dates with penciled notes beside them, an entry that read like a ledger's confession, funds directed for women's leadership training, and then an arrow to building expenses. A small notation almost casual about reallocation. A promise folded and placed in another pocket. For a moment Bishop Williams' color drained away. The artificial tan he'd worn for years could not hide the whiteness that crept into his face. His mouth thinned. The ring on his finger caught the sunlight and threw a bright stubborn dot across the pulpit. I felt my breath come in a rush, then stop. Hands trembled in the pews. Deacon Phillips whispered something fast into the bishop's ear. A rustle like flapping paper. The room held its breath the way it does between verses, that tight, holy pause before a congregation decides whether to sing or to walk out. I had not planned for him to take the mic. I had not planned the exact shape of the moment, only that the truth would not be left to sit in a box any longer. Standing there with my Bible open on the floor and the photocopies like small pale flags, I knew what I had to do. I would not let a ledger decide who could speak in this place. I would not let a promise stay folded. So I stood with my shoulders straight and my hands steady. I stepped forward to gather what had spilled, and in that step I felt the room lean with me. The papers lay like small pale flags on the floor. The bishop's jaw tightened. He cleared his throat the way someone clears away a tablecloth, quick, practiced. "We will pray," he answered. His hand shifted, the ring catching light like a challenge. But his eyes kept returning to the papers. I watched him in that tiny terrible way you watch someone you love who is about to make a choice that will not be good for them. There was a flicker, not of guilt exactly but of calculation. I thought of the Thompsons' envelope, fat and promise-laced, sitting on a conference table like an altar to comfort. You could almost see the ledger lines that led from their checkbook to his resolve. Esther stood. Her hat looked like a small sun. She did not shout. She did not call for attention. She rose with the measured grace of someone who has tended to children in winter, held new mothers, buried friends. Her white-gloved hand found mine, and for a second we were back in my kitchen at dusk, steaming tea and her voice saying, "Promise me you'll speak your truth." That memory was a photograph too. Grainy, warm, and stubborn. Marcus got up next. He did not shout. He did not step in front of me like a young soldier. He rose and his shoulders made a straight line toward the pulpit, like a spine remembering its duty. He looked at the bishop and did not look away. There was a tightness at the corner of his mouth that told me more than any speech. I felt the pulse at my temple matching his. I felt young and old at the same time. Someone started to whisper, low and careful, like wind through the rafters. Rebecca, with the baby tucked against her chest, rose and held the child as if to say, "We are listening for them." The congregation unfolded, one by one, even the hesitant folks in the pews by the back. No placards. No banners. Just bodies shifting, a small revolution in the shape of people standing. The bishop watched the room. His face a map of lines I had not seen before. Once he had been all ease, smiles, hands, the practiced angles of a man who knew how to smooth corners. Now his lips went thin, and I saw the quick blink at the corner of his eye that people make when they are trying to find the right argument they were certain they'd never need. Deacon Phillips bent forward and said something that looked like counsel and pressure both. His lips moved, his hand tapped his thigh. His eyes flicked to the doorway where some of the wealthier families sat, neat collars, the slight curl of privilege in their posture. He whispered as if pressing a reed. The whisper felt like a draft. He pushed the microphone back toward me with a movement that was small and monumental. "The word is yours, Deaconess Ruth," he said, and the words were a mix. A blade and a gift in the same breath. There was no apology in them. There was, however, a look that said he had been forced to choose not by his conscience but by the weight of faces in a room that had always obeyed him. I remember my hands then, how they shook as if from cold. The pearls at my ears clicked softly as I lifted the mic. The paper in my pocket felt like a coal. I could have, in that perfect, neat world, folded the photocopies back into the Bible and walked away. I could have let the ledger sleep. But when I stepped forward, I felt those small faces who had been taught by women in this church flocking behind me. The little girls who learned to pray by saying amen like a chorus. The boys who learned to tie ties by the hands of the women who folded them. Those faces were a procession of photographs. When I spoke, my voice was not loud. It was not triumphant. It was the voice I had used at kitchen tables and in hospital rooms. I spoke about promises, of how money can be a blessing and a choice, and how promises folded away in a drawer are still promises. I felt Deacon Phillips' fingers press into the edge of the pulpit like a man holding a rope. I felt the bishop's throat work when he swallowed. His hand rested on his Bible as if trying to find shelter there. After the service, the foyer smelled of coffee and coats. The room shimmered with that after-service air. People lingering, footsteps, the rustle of programs. Some faces were soft with a new pride. Others went taut and cold. The Thompsons did not linger. I watched from the side as a sleek car idled and a man with a clipped voice said a few words to the bishop that looked like numbers made into sentences. They left with their coats flaring like flags. But not all doors closed. Esther found me and squeezed my arm so hard her gloves made my skin pucker. "You did it," she whispered, and her eyes had that small, wet shine that happens when someone has kept watch and then sees the dawn. Marcus stood with his hands in his pockets, jaw working, and did not say much. He probably did not need to. Deacon Johnson tapped his cane and nodded, the slowest, truest kind of approval. Deacon Phillips came up to me then, his mouth a thin line. He did not raise his voice. He looked at me as if assessing measurement and consequence. "You know this will change things," he said, not a question. His fingers fiddled with the edge of his Bible. There was a tremor in his lip I had not seen in years. "You understand the cost, right?" I watched the tiny photograph of his hands, hands that had once carried casseroles to funerals, hands that had held hymn books for a lifetime. I thought of the ledger again, of the cigar box hiding in the archives like a secret, of promises turned sideways. I smiled without teeth. "I understand," I said. The word held small terrors and small hopes both. That night, as I folded my sermon back into its neat quarters and laid the pearl earrings on the dresser, the church felt bigger and smaller at once. Bigger because voices had moved. Smaller because some people had turned away. The micro-reactions of the day replayed in my mind. The bishop's ring glinting, Esther's hat like a lighthouse, Marcus' steady breath. They were photographs I would keep. They were proof that truth, once set down like a piece of paper in the sun, cannot be folded back into darkness without someone noticing the crease. After that Sunday, the church didn't roar. It congealed into a quiet that followed me like a shadow. At first it was small things. The woman who used to hug me every week, Mildred, with her soft cardigan and the hymn book always bent at Amazing Grace, walked past me in the fellowship hall as if she had suddenly become allergic to my presence. Her hand closed over a casserole dish like a shield. "Nice to see you, Sister Ruth," she said. But her eyes slid past mine as if the words needed saving for someone else. Her voice was polite. Her body was absent. I noticed the empty chair at the Wednesday Bible study. It had my name on the reserve list for years, a habit as ordinary as the coffee pot. When I walked in, the leader paused mid-sentence, smiled that thin, practiced smile and rearranged the circle. "Oh, we've," she began, and the rest of the sentence dissolved into a cough. The pages of their study Bibles rustled like a nervous breeze. Doors began to close more literally. Invitations that used to arrive in neat, typed letters, funeral luncheons, potlucks, the centennial planning meeting, either stopped coming or were handed to me in doorways, the giver stepping back as if the threshold itself might decide to take me in or keep me out. At the thrift drive, the volunteer coordinator checked his list twice and then said, "We've got plenty of hands this week, Ruth. Thank you, though." His smile was quick, a bandage over his discomfort. Whispers followed me from pew to pew. I would sit on a bench and feel small currents of conversation parting around me, the clipping of words like stolen thread. Mothers shifted babies into another row. Teenagers I had taught in Sunday school stared straight at the hymnals, their shoulders tight with something like shame. One man from the finance committee walked by the parking lot and crossed the street rather than stand in the same shadowed line at the coffee urn. It felt less like anger and more like a polite erasure. There were messages. Some were lovely, handwritten notes folded like little prayers, cards with pressed flowers from neighbors who had known my mother. Esther's letters came in thick, purple ink. Marcus texted me short, fierce sentences that made me feel like a lighthouse he had anchored against. "We're good," he wrote. "Don't let them make this about you. You're not alone." But the ones that multiplied were different. Emails from old board members suddenly unavailable. A few phone calls that began with small talk and ended with excuses. The church newsletter that used to carry my choir photo in the corner now listed events with asterisks where my name had been. The Centennial Committee's minutes arrived with my proposed workshop quietly omitted. Sometimes the avoidance showed up in public places. At the bakery where I bought raisin buns for Sunday's coffee hour, The counterwoman looked at the back of her hand as she totaled my change. The pastor's office door, which had always been open as a courtesy and a comfort, started to shut faster when I approached. Deacon Phillips would clear his throat when I passed. His smiles had thinned into something like duty. Even Deacon Johnson moved through his day with a new intelligence. He listened more, but his visits were shorter, his hand on my shoulder gentler and then withdrawn as if testing the temperature of a wound. Gossip found voices on the phone and in the grocery line. It dressed itself in concern. "It's complicated. We must be careful. These are delicate times for leadership." Words wrapped in worry, but their edges were barbed. People who had once trusted me with recipes and family stories now spoke to me like a subject under examination, like a weather event to be talked about behind curtains. Kids, bless them, were less guarded. A little girl tugged my sleeve at a memorial and said, "Grandma says some grown-ups are mean." She didn't understand protocol. She understood fairness. Her innocence was a small trumpet I carried home with me. Some things remain tender. Deacon Johnson still sat with me sometimes on the cement steps outside the church and talked about the old hymns. Esther never let the line of our friendship fray. She sent casseroles and stories, and once, a hat with a purple feather that made me feel like a queen in a forgotten court. Marcus brought me coffee in paper cups that steamed between our hands. His presence was a constant I could rest against. A handful of families continued to show up for the youth program, to knock gently at my door and ask for advice, as if supply and demand in charity had nothing to do with the politics in the office. But the net was closing. Conversations that used to be easy now required permission. A soft boycott formed, not cruel but efficient. People walked around me to keep the peace. They chose committees where my name was not required. They scheduled events on days I was likely to be away. The church calendar filled in ways that made me invisible by default. The isolation was corrosive in small measures. It seeped into afternoons and found me with the blinds drawn, the house quiet save for the hum of the refrigerator. I felt the town's attention like weather. Clouds rolling in, the distant drum of thunder. Each whisper, each glance built a borderline I could see, even if it had no gate. Still, inside that hush, something else hardened. Every closed door left a brick exposed in a future wall I could build differently. Each whisper revealed the seams of power in the places where promises had been folded away. It hurt, yes, but it also made the need for change undeniable. So I kept showing up. I walked into the fellowship hall and filled a plate. I answered calls when I could. I taught the youth class on Thursday nights to the few brave children who continued to come. In the quiet, I listened for the faces that would not step back, and I learned to hold them like light. When the microphone clicked back into my hand, it was like being handed a small hot coal. My fingers closed around the metal and shook. I could feel the pearl earrings at my lobes tapping against my jaw when I swallowed. For a second I only heard the blood in my ears, a steady, slow drum, and then the organ sighed into a chord that seemed to settle dust from the rafters. The sanctuary breathed with us. I set my palms together, thumb over thumb, like I'd done at countless kitchen tables and hospital beds. Breathe and hold, breathe out. The rhythm steadied me enough to taste words before they found my mouth. My sermon was in my pocket, folded 3 times. The photocopies of the ledger were between pages like a blade and a blessing. The paper rubbed warm against my thigh. The smell of old wood and lilies was sharp under the heat of the lights, and somewhere behind me someone whispered a hymn, soft as a prayer. My voice came out thin at first. It trembled, a small reed in a long wind. But the room answered it. The sound hit the wooden ceiling and came back to me with a slight echo, like my own heartbeat answering itself. You learn, after a lifetime of leading prayers, how a room will carry a voice if you let it. I let it. I stand here with a promise, I said, and the words felt like stepping into cold water. Signed and recorded, meant for education, meant for the women who raised this church. I could see Bishop Williams in the corner of my eye, the line of his jaw sharp as a creditor's note. Deacon Philip's knuckles were white where they curled around the pulpit. Deacon Johnson's cane scraped, a small metronome in the hush. When I mentioned the ledger, people leaned forward. You could hear it. A faint rustle, the breath of a congregation shifting its weight. Esther's hat was a bright punctuation mark as she rose. Marcus' shoulders squared. He did not need to speak. The photocopies lay open on the floor in the light, their edges catching like small stubborn flames. I could smell the ink, the old paper, the dust of an attic. That smell opened a place in my chest I'd kept closed for too many years. I read a passage from the ledger out loud. My voice steadied on the numbers and the names. Each syllable was an anchor. The echo in that room made the words larger than the page. When I said the word reallocated, it sounded like a verdict. The people in front of me, faces I'd changed diapers for, men I'd listened to at funerals, watched like they were seeing the floor shift. There was a tiny wind then, barely a gasp as half the room stood. It moved through the sanctuary like a tide, chairs creaking, a scarf brushing against a pew. The single white candle on the altar flickered in that current. I noticed it as something private between me and the light. It leaned, and then the flame fell in on itself and went dark, leaving a black halo like a question. If the candle going out was an accident, the crucifix tipping was not planned. The brass cross on the altar, polished a little too often, caught the light and then wobbled as the currents in the room shifted, feet moving, hearts moving, and finally toppled with a sound that rang through the hall. It was not loud like a crash. It was a small metallic exclamation that made the room stiller than the hush had been before. In that single note, the past and present seemed to touch. The bishop flinched as if the sound had named him. His hand went to the ring on his finger as if to find purchase. For a heartbeat I saw something cross his face, calculation maybe, or surprise that a ledger could make a man so small. Deacon Phillips leaned toward him, whispering counsel and caution. His voice was the rustling of pages. I felt the tension in the air like a stretched string waiting to be plucked. I kept my hands folded. I did not raise my voice to fill the empty. I let each sentence land, and in the pause between I listened. There was the scent of coffee from the foyer, the whisper of a child's shoe on the floor, the metallic tang of adrenaline. I noticed when a woman near the back clutched her purse so hard the leather creaked. I noticed the way people's mouths shaped themselves around old truths, how some lips tightened and others softened. Promises are not ledgers to be shuffled, I said. They are lives. My voice grew warmer. I was no longer speaking merely to the bishop or the council. I was speaking to the women who had folded their dreams to make space for others, to the little girls in church dresses, to the mothers who stood in kitchens humming hymns. I felt their hands like an unseen choir behind my back. From where I stood I could see the micro details of a room changing its mind. A man who typically kept his eyes down now looked up. His chin lifted as if he too were remembering a name. A teenager in the third pew had her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles shone white. Rebecca held her baby closer, and the child's breath was a soft counterpoint to the organ. When I reached the end of the passage, my throat was thick. The echo settled like dust. The sanctuary no longer felt like a hall sewn together by rules nobody wanted to break. It felt like a tent being packed up and moved, seams being tested, some threads cutting, others holding. Bishop Williams looked at the faces around him and then at me. He returned the microphone earlier because more than his authority was at stake. The room was deciding. In that moment, as the cross lay on its side and the candle held only a wick of smoke, I understood the shape of the change. It was loud and quiet at once. A door had started to creak open. My hands, still clasped, trembled. I let the tremor be honest. We had reached the point where truth and ritual bumped into one another like two old friends who had grown apart. The sound of that crucifix on the floor would live with me. Not as an ending, but as the small, unexpected sound a world makes when it begins to right itself. The room emptied around us, slow as molasses. People folded into conversations like hands closing over small things. casseroles, condolences, curiosities. I stood at the pulpit. When the door closed behind the last stragglers, the sanctuary felt both smaller and somehow more honest. Faces I had known since I was a girl looked back at me with new shapes. Some were tender. Some were guarded. The Thompsons were gone. Their polished coats and polite nods traded for silence where the cold of their absence lived in the fellowship hall like a draft. They left as if making a practical correction. The building fund meeting they'd been to the night before had been a ledger and a promise, and when ledger and promise collided with memory, they chose balance over community. But other doors opened. People I had never met before walked up to the table with casseroles and folded their hands around my elbow like a bridge. Local teachers called to offer after-school volunteers. A pair of retired nurses from the clinic left a note that said simply, "If you start the leadership classes, we'll teach." Small checks came in envelopes without names, from households I'd seen in the parking lot or at school plays. The donations were smaller. They were also steady. They came with handwritten notes. For the kids. For the women who lead. For the center. Over time, the numbers added up not like the quick flourish of one big check, but like the patient accumulation of coin jars on porches. The weeks after that Sunday were a slow stitch. Some Saturdays found me at the archives again, measuring out the ledger pages like a recipe. I photocopied what I had found and placed each copy where it belonged, in the hands of those who asked, in the file cabinet the council could not hide, in the envelopes that would go to the wider church board. I did not want to lynch anyone. I wanted honesty. I wanted the promise made long ago to be spoken aloud and honored, even if imperfectly. There were meetings. There were awkward dinners where people tried to rearrange the grammar of what had happened into safer words. Bishop Williams retreated into that office he keeps so polished, and his smiles thinned into something closer to calculation. Deacon Phillips found new errands. Deacon Johnson visited more slowly, and his cane made a particular sound on the sidewalk that always steadied me. And there was Esther. She never faltered. Her purple hat arrived at my door with stew and a note that read, "Keep going." She squeezed my hand the way she had the Sunday after her husband died. The firm motherly pressure of someone who knows grief and also how to bury it. Marcus was my shadow in a good way. He sat on committees, passed out flyers, argued quietly with older men who could not see beyond the comfort a bank account brings. His presence was a kind of prayer I could trust. Not everything healed. Some friendships thinned to polite nods. Invitations stopped arriving from certain circles. The youth bake sale this summer lost a prominent sponsor. Those were losses that felt like small knives. But each loss exposed a seam where something new might be sown. Those who left did so for reasons they said they believed in. Those who stayed, and those who came, did so because the idea of the church as refuge and repair mattered more than the gloss of tradition. We formed a building committee that didn't lean on a single donor. We hosted potlucks where folks wrote their names on jars to be counted and accounted for. We offered leadership workshops that began as a handful of women in the fellowship hall, and swelled into classes full of questions and laughter, and the kind of honest chatter you only get when people decide to keep one another. We named the first scholarship for women in the church in small letters and larger hearts. It wasn't the center the Thompsons had dreamed of. It was better in a way their money couldn't buy, built by the many. The bishop's public posture softened only a little. He returned to the pulpit with a different script, one that had to acknowledge to readers' surprise that things had shifted. He did not apologize in the way I would have liked. He did, reluctantly, sign off on a committee that would oversee the funds. That is a small thing perhaps, but small things accumulate into structures. The ledger of that night found its new place not in a drawer but in meetings, in minutes, in the memory of people who had watched and then chosen. More than anything, what changed for me was the sound inside my chest. The weight I'd carried for decades, of being thanked for casseroles and overlooked for leadership, lifted in a way that was not sudden but inevitable. The revelation had roots. It had been grown from decisions made in rooms without women, from archives tucked away in cigar boxes, from the quiet assumption that promises could be repurposed without notice. Revealing it was not a miracle. It was the consequence of looking. Now when I stand at the pulpit, I feel the paper in my pocket like a talisman and also like a responsibility. I do not preach to wound. I preach to remind. I remind people that a promise is a person. A girl learning to read under a kitchen light. A mother balancing work and devotion. A woman who taught the choir because no one had asked her to lead, and yet she led. I preach with the sound of women's names in my throat, and I let the congregation hear the ledger as a lesson. Sometimes the sanctuary still holds its breath before I speak, the old silent wait. But more often now it hums. The organ's chords seem to stretch differently. People who once stepped around me lean in. A few will always prefer the old ways, and that is their choice. But the center will be built. Not by a single check, but by hands that will keep coming on Tuesdays and Thursdays. By children who will have a place to be after school. By women whose names will finally be written in budgets and in the minutes. On my porch at dusk, I watch the light over Oak Ridge and think of paper left in drawers and promises that don't die when they're forgotten. They wait. I think of Esther's hat and Marcus' quiet pride, and the way Deacon Johnson taps his cane when he agrees with something important. The crucifix will be polished again. The candle will be relit. The sound it makes when it goes out taught us something. It taught us that small things can become the story. When I walk back into the sanctuary, I tuck my sermon and the photocopies into my Bible, not as weapons but as witnesses. I straighten my pearls, feel the familiar weight, and step up. The room answers me now, not like a locked ledger, but like a choir learning a new hymn. My voice is not the only one rising. It never was. It is simply one that was given a chance to be heard. And that, more than anything, feels like prayer. The sanctuary is quieter now. Not the hollow silence that smothers you when people are angry, but a different kind. The kind that holds space for things to settle. I sit in the second pew on the left, the one I used to keep empty for a memory, and I watch the light move across the wood. It makes little maps on the hymnals, dust motes floating like tiny psalms. When the last of them left this morning, a faint smell of coffee lingered, stale and sweet, and a single plate with crumbs remained on the refreshment table. Someone had left a used bulletin folded on the edge like a small creature. The organ had stopped. The brass cross lay polished now behind the altar, its face catching the sunlight and throwing a quiet back at me. It had been tipped that Sunday. Someone had straightened it. Someone had seen to the candle and relit it, so that there was a thin, steady wick of light. It smelled faintly of wax and lilies, clean as a promise kept. My Bible is heavy in my lap. The photocopies are still tucked inside, folded in the places I read aloud. They are not sharp like accusations anymore. They are witnesses. I feel their paper thin against my thumb and think about the hands that put them there. My own trembling. Esther's steady palms that squeezed mine. Marcus' impatient, hopeful press on my shoulder. Even Deacon Johnson's cane is a kind of testimony. The metronome that keeps time for people learning a new rhythm. There are small, ordinary things that tell me the story is not over, only changed. Esther's purple hat hangs on the pegs in the foyer, its feather a little frayed at the edge. Marcus took the old wooden bench from the back and set it outside the youth room where the children can sit and tie their shoes. Someone left a jar of coins on the committee table with a note. For the kids. The checks that came in after the Sunday, small handwritten. They were like steady raindrops into an empty jar. They add up. People still avoid me sometimes. I feel it in the sideways greetings, the careful recalculations of conversations. The Thompsons did not come back. Their car did not return to the parking lot with its polite nods. That absence is a cold place in the fellowship hall, I can feel when I carry trays. I don't pretend it doesn't hurt. Loss is a particular kind of echo. But loss has a shape, and that shape makes room for something else. When I walk up the aisle now, there is a different air in the room. It hums more than it hushes. Faces look up instead of away. A few new names appear on the sign-up sheet for. I think of the Sabbath day when my Bible hit the floor and the papers scattered. I think of the way Deacon Johnson cleared his throat and the way the room leaned. I think of the small sounds that changed everything. The thud of the book, the rustle of photocopies, the whisper that turned into a stand. Those are the noises that live inside me like a melody. They are not the drumbeats of triumph. They are the softer notes of a hymn being relearned. There are nights when the silence in my house is loud and I can almost hear the measure of things counting in my chest. I lay out my sermon again sometimes, not to rehearse words but to remind myself that promises can be made visible. The pearl earrings rest in my jewelry box like two small moons. I put them on Sundays because ritual steadies me. I iron my dress carefully. I fold the papers and slide them back into the Bible like a sentinel tucking a child into bed. The wind has a way of closing the church door these days that sounds less like an ending and more like a punctuation. It clicks, then settles. Footsteps recede through the sanctuary in a pattern I have learned to listen for. A heel, a toe, a pause. Sometimes Marcus is the last to leave, his sneakers whispering across the floor as he gathers up a chair or a stack of handouts. Sometimes it's Esther, slow in her movement but precise. She pauses at the threshold and pats the hymnals as if sitting them down gently. The pew I favored is sometimes empty when I arrive, sunlight pouring along its grain. The space feels hollow and tender all at once. An empty pew can be a wound or an invitation. In the quiet I choose to hear it as both. I learned to place something there that matters, a folded program, a note with a name, a small scarf, and the emptiness becomes less an absence than a place for new stories. When the last pair of footsteps finally leave the lot on a Sunday, there is a small sound I have started to savor. The wind will move across the threshold, and the front doors will meet. There is a soft, decisive click, a breath of air that leaks out and then the lock turning. I stand in the doorway and feel the cool evening settle over Oak Ridge like a shawl. The world has the smell of cut grass and distant supper. My palms are warm from the microphone. My throat still tastes faintly of wax and ink. I close the door behind me and let the wind take the sound with it. The door shuts and there is a quiet that is not empty but expectant. The hymnals are closed. The brass cross is upright. The candle throws a steady prayer through a narrow window. I walk down the steps, the gravel crunching under my shoes, and the sound of my own footsteps follows me down the path so slowly I can hear it like a second heart. Something ended that day, yes. A silence was broken, and a ledger was opened. But as the wind closes the door and the porch light flicks on in my hall, I know something else has just begun. The empty pew waits. The center will be built, one small coin, one casserole, one class at a time. The sound of footsteps leaving the sanctuary has the shape of farewell and of invitation all at once. I breathe in. I lock the door. I turn and walk toward the porch light. And the night is full of small promises, patient as prayer. I still carry the memory of that hand, Bishop Williams' fingers closing around the microphone, like a bruise you can press and remember. It taught me how thin the line is between authority and loneliness, how easily a room can be held together by habit until someone drops a page and the seams show. For a long time after that Sunday, I measured time by small sounds. The click of keys on the church office door, the scrape of Deacon Johnson's cane on the sidewalk, the soft thud of my Bible when I set it down at home. Sitting on my porch as the light thins over Oak Ridge, I run my thumb along the photocopies folded into my Bible. They are ordinary paper, edges curling, the ink faint in places, but they feel holy in a way the polished pulpit never was. Those pages started as a small discovery, nothing dramatic in itself, and they became the hinge on which our congregation slowly turned. People ask me if I wanted to make the bishop look bad. I wanted something simpler, for a promise to be kept. The days that followed were quieter than I expected. Some folks left like the last notes of a hymn that have nowhere to go, Some arrived, pulling up chairs to make room for conversation. The Thompsons' absence left a cold place in the fellowship hall, a chair that sat too straight, but their missing checks taught us how small hands and steady mouths can do the work a single big check once promised. The center's blueprint changed. It lost marble plans and gained a kitchen table committee and the steady, slower faith that comes from neighbors putting in time rather than money. People showed me the math of revelation in ways that were both tender and sharp. A woman I had taught Sunday school to brought a casserole and a handwritten note that read, "For the kids who need a place to be." A retired nurse offered to teach first aid. Marcus spent 2 Saturday mornings stapling flyers at the community college, his dreads tucked under a beanie, the kind of steady labor that felt like prayer. And there were costs. Invitations that once arrived like warm letters now came on the back of polite distance. Some friendships thinned into nods and bakery hellos. I learned to carry absence like a folded cloth. Not to hide it, but to stitch it into something useful. In those thin spaces I found new textures. The way Esther's laugh fills a room, the firmness of Marcus' jaw when he speaks up in a meeting, the slow approval of Deacon Johnson when he taps his cane and says, "We did right." When I step into the sanctuary now, the air feels different. It hums. The organ's chords are the same, but they carry new weight. Not because the building has changed, but because the people in it have. There are faces I didn't know before at the back of the room. Teachers from the elementary school, neighbors who came because a flyer said after-school care, women in work boots who bring confident hands and sensible questions. The building committee meets with a stack of notebooks instead of a single glossy brochure. We count coins. We count time. We count the names of those who will use the center. Each tally is a small promise kept. Sometimes I still see Bishop Williams' hand in my mind. I don't know if he sleeps well. He comes to the pulpit with less of the easy charm he once wore like a coat. He signed the committee papers in the end in a way that felt like a bargain more than a conversion. People will remember their own parts. People will remember his. My hope is that someone else will one day find dusty papers in an attic and choose to hold them up rather than tuck them back. The crumbled candle on the altar, the one that guttered the day of the microphone, has been relit more than once. We cleaned the brass cross and set it upright. We patched the hymnals. We rebuilt things slowly, with hands that felt the strain of work and the sweetness of repair. Some Sundays the room swells with the sound of new voices. Other Sundays it is small and private and stitched with care. I learned more than anything that truth does not always need a trumpet. Sometimes it needs a steady hand and a photocopier and a woman who will fold a paper into her pocket and take the long way to a pulpit. I learned that power can be felt in how a community chooses to be kind or small. I learned that a promise tucked in a cigar box can be more stubborn than a checkbook. At night I iron my dress for Sunday. The pearl earrings wait in the blue velvet box, an old comfort. I fold the sermon and feel the papers in my pocket like the warm pulse of something alive. The city hums beyond the steeple, tires on Main, a dog barking, someone calling their child's name down the block. Inside me a smaller sound has settled. The careful, patient rhythm of people who have decided that a church can be more than a place of preservation. It can be a place of repair. When I speak now, I try to use words that do not break what is fragile but do not bury what is true. I tell stories, I read scripture, I name names when names need naming. I stand with the memory of the ledger and the memory of all the women who taught me how to pray without being seen. Those are the voices that taught me courage. In the hush between services, I sometimes close my eyes and listen, to the organ warming up, to footsteps on the wooden floor, to the murmur of 2 women folding napkins in the kitchen. There is grief here, yes. There is also steady, ordinary joy. It is neither dramatic nor loud. It is the kind of thing that shows up when you least expect it and then keeps showing up until it becomes a habit. I do not pretend we are finished. Some doors will never reopen, and some faces will not return. But the ledger is no longer an ember in a box. It's a record, a witness. The center will be built by hands, not headlines. And every Sunday when I tuck those photocopies back into my Bible, they fit in like bones in a hand. There is a secret I have kept, and now I tell it plainly. Promises, even when folded away. If you've made it this far, thank you from the bottom of my heart for staying until the end. If you feel it in your heart, please subscribe so you won't miss the next stories, and keep walking with me by watching the other videos I've prepared with care. And please, share in the comments what you thought of my testimony. I will read every word.